The Revelation Explained by F. G. Smith, Chapter 16, Part 5. We continue with the commentary. When he invaded Russia, and this is referring to Napoleon, a territory outside of the apocalyptic earth, he exceeded his mission, and there met with the most terrible overthrow. Although he entered that kingdom with the most magnificent army that he had ever gathered together, yet for suffering and disaster that famous retreat from burning Moscow stands without a parallel in history. It was not the Russian armies that prevailed against him. It was God that fought against him with the blasts of his north wind. These speedily silenced those tremendous parks of artillery that had thundered upon the fields of Jena, Friedland, Wagram, Marengo, and Austerlitz, and scattered those invincible battalions that had marched triumphant over Europe. Ney, at the head of the National Guards, ever before victorious, was compelled to beat a hasty retreat, glad to escape with the smallest remnant of his host. Napoleon failed here because God had given him no mission to perform in that territory. Concerning his ambition, the Encyclopedia Britannica says, quote, "With a frame of iron, Napoleon could endure any hardships, and in war, in artillery especially, and engineering, he stands unrivaled in the world's history. He could not rest, and knew not when he had achieved success. He succeeded in alienating the peoples of Europe, in whose behalf he pretended to be acting. And when they learned by bitter experience that he had absolutely no love for liberty, and encouraged equality only so long as it was an equality of subjects under his rule, they soon began to war against what was in fact a world-destroying military despotism." End quote. He was inspired with the most unbounded ambition, which was nothing short of despotism over all Europe, if not the world. Universal empire was his grand object, or, as it has been expressed by historians, a desire to concentrate, quote, "the world in Europe, Europe in France, France in Paris, Paris in himself." End quote. Says Wicks, quote, "The empire which he actually reared in Europe was a vast, oppressive, centralized despotism. To build it up, he desolated France through his terrible conscriptions, requiring the whole strength and flower of the nation to supply his armies. It is stated that after the wars of Napoleon, there were 3 times the number of women in France that there were of men. The fathers, the husbands, the sons, the brothers had fallen upon the battlefield, and thus desolated almost every household in the kingdom. Similar desolation also he carried by his wars into the other kingdoms." End quote. The dread of Napoleon settled down upon all the nations of Europe. They could not cope with his mighty genius, and therefore his presence was a terror to them. When the Allied powers secured his first abdication in 1814 and sent him to the island of Elba, The desolating results of his long career were shown in the work that the Congress of Vienna was called upon to perform when it assembled in the fall of 1814. While the representatives of the powers were laboring to repair the damage that had been wrought and to adjust the territorial limitations of the various nations that had been altered or entirely demolished, the assemblage was suddenly surprised the following spring by the news that Napoleon had escaped from Elba and was en route to Paris. The terror and consternation in Europe then experienced is shown by the following quotation from Sir James Mackintosh, a man of high reputation as a jurist, as a historian, and as a far-sighted and candid statesman. Quote, "Was it in the power of language to describe the evil wars which had raged for more than 20 years throughout Europe, which had spread blood and desolation from Cadiz to Moscow, and from Naples to Copenhagen, which had wasted the means of human enjoyment, and destroyed the instruments of social improvement, which threatened to diffuse among the European nations the dissolute and ferocious habits of a predatory soldiery, had been brought to a close. Europe seemed to breathe after her sufferings. In the midst of this fair prospect, and of these consolatory hopes, Napoleon Bonaparte escaped from Elba. 3 small vessels reached the coast of Provence. Their hopes are instantly dispelled. The work of our toil and fortitude is undone. The blood of Europe is spilled in vain." End quote. The bitterest ingredients in the cup of these nations was the humiliating overthrow of their own government and their subjection to the hated republican despotism of France. It was a scorching sun that they could not endure. Still, they repented not to give God glory. They continued as before. After Napoleon had accomplished the purpose for which he was intended, God permitted this stupendous genius to be subdued. But it required the combined powers of Europe to secure his downfall. Crecy, in his 15 decisive battles of the world, says concerning the Battle of Waterloo, "The great battle which ended the 23 years' war of the first French Revolution, and which quelled the man whose genius and ambition had so long disturbed and desolated the world, deserves to be regarded by us with peculiar gratitude for the repose which it secured for us and for the greater part of the human race." End quote. We continue now by reading the book of Revelation, chapter 16, verses 10 and 11. "And the 5th angel poured out his vial upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain, and blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and repented not of their deeds." We continue now with the commentary. Under this vial the symbols differ somewhat. The beast is evidently the one of whom the image was made, referred to in verse 2, the papacy. The seat that the papacy occupied from the time the dragon resigned in favor of the beast, in chapter 13, verse 2, was his position of temporal power and authority. In the following chapter, the papacy is described as seated upon a 10-horned beast, the 10 horns of which symbolize the kingdoms of Europe. In this position, it was able to exercise a guiding influence over the European nations. We have already seen what great power the popes exercised in this direction during the Dark Ages. But the beast of chapter 17 himself, as distinguished from his horns, symbolizes the Holy Roman Empire, which was a revival of the old empire of the Caesars. This revived world empire was closely allied to the papacy. When Charlemagne, the Carlovingian king, restored the empire of the West, he was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in AD 800. Quote, "The popes made the descendants of Charles Martel kings and emperors. The grateful Frankish princes defended the popes against all their enemies, imperial and barbarian, and dowering them with cities and provinces, laid the basis of their temporal sovereignty, which continued for more than 1,000 years." End quote. After the decline of the Carlovingian power, the imperial authority was again revived by Otto the Great in 962, who was crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope. Henceforth, the Empire of the West was termed the Holy Roman Empire. Quote, "From this time on, it was the rule that the German king who was crowned at Aachen had a right to be crowned emperor at Rome." End quote. So the general rule was that the popes upheld the emperors, and the emperors sustained the popes in their position as the spiritual heads of the church and as temporal rulers over the papal states, which were granted them originally by the donations of Pepin and Charlemagne. In chapter 13, the civil powers of Europe and the ecclesiastical power of Rome are not shown by a double symbol, a man and a beast, as in chapter 17, but are there represented by a combination of symbols drawn from the departments of human life and animal life, which shows that a politico-religious system is intended, as heretofore explained, hence the term beast, as there used, signifies either the papacy or the civil power. Thus the term is used in the present chapter under consideration and has reference here to the beast as an ecclesiastical power, the papacy, and his seat refers to his temporal authority. This vial, then, being poured out upon his seat, with the result that his kingdom was filled with darkness, a symbol drawn from nature, points to the downfall of the Pope as a temporal ruler. Thus he would be deprived of his seat. We have already seen that each plague prepares the way for a succeeding one. Under the reign of Napoleon, the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved in 1806. This was the beginning of the end of the Pope's temporal authority, for the two had, in a great measure, been for ages interdependent upon each other. Pius VII was made a prisoner, and the temporal sovereignty of the Roman See declared to be at an end, while the Pope himself was forced to disown all claim to rank as a temporal ruler. Of course, this was but a temporary overthrow, for when the period of reaction came, the Pope recovered also temporal authority. But the vast territories of Avignon, Venaissin, Bologna, Ferrara, and the Romagna, representing fully a third of all the papal dominions which had been forcibly ceded to France under Napoleon, was never restored to the Roman see. From that time the sun of the Pope's temporal kingdom rapidly approached the horizon. While the inhabitants of his dominions continued to blaspheme God through the atheistical Jacobinism that infested to so great an extent the whole mass of society, symbolized by their swords, and the firm supporters of popery were filled with excessive chagrin and mortification of mind, symbolized by their pains, because the power of their leader, who professed temporal sovereignty over the whole earth, was being suddenly destroyed, and his kingdom left in darkness. Concerning this matter, the People's Cyclopedia, after speaking of the blow the Pope's spiritual supremacy received at the Reformation, says, quote, "But in her relations to the state, the Roman Church has since passed through a long and critical struggle. The new theories to which the French Revolution gave currency have still further modified these relations." End quote. In the Second Revolution of 1848, the Pope's temporal authority was about to be entirely destroyed by the attempted establishment of the Republic of Italy. But at this juncture, France, who, notwithstanding her plagues, had not repented of her former deeds, not willing to desert entirely the papal cause after upholding it faithfully for centuries, interfered, and the Pope was sustained in his position by a French garrison until 1870, except a short time in 1867, at which time the success of King Victor Emmanuel and his capture of the Eternal City established the free government of United Italy. The temporal sun of the Pope set forever. His kingdom was left in darkness. We'll end part 5 of chapter 16 here.